At 98, the tragedy of Betty Harford is beyond heartbreaking. At 98, the tragedy of Betty Harford is beyond heartbreaking. For 70 years, she moved quietly through Hollywood's corridors, not chasing the spotlight, but keeping it alive for others. There was a time when she stood beside television royalty, John Houseman in The Paper Chase, Joan Collins, and John Forsythe in Dynasty. Millions saw her every week, yet few ever spoke her name. She was Hilda the housekeeper, Mrs. Nottingham, the secretary, the dependable woman who held the glamorous world of others together, both on and off screen. And when the applause faded, she returned to an empty home in California, where her fame had evaporated, leaving behind only quiet, film reels and the soft hum of a bygone era. For those who remember her, Betty wasn't just a supporting actress. She was the gentle ghost of old Hollywood, the woman who proved that dignity doesn't need applause. But hidden behind that grace was a lifetime of rejection, sacrifice, and an invisible heartbreak no audience ever saw. And now, as her story closes at 98, we uncover what Hollywood forgot and what she never stopped giving. Betty Harford was born on the 28th of January, 1927, in New York City, in a world already in love with the dream of cinema. Her childhood unfolded between Depression-era theaters and the sound of radio dramas. To the little girl sitting cross-legged on the floor, the voices on the radio weren't strangers, they were family. According to her son, Chris, Betty was enchanted by sound before she ever saw her first film. That obsession would follow her all her life, a fascination with dialogue, tone, and the small emotional beats that made stories human. By her early 20s, she was drawn to the stage not for attention, but for escape. In the late 1940s, New York's theater scene was alive with post-war hope and artistic rebellion. The Actors Studio had just been founded. Method acting was revolutionizing performance. Betty took small parts, learned from anyone who'd let her watch, and quietly began shaping her craft. Those who knew her then describe her as sharp, intense, deeply empathetic. A fellow actor from a 1,950 seconds off-Broadway production recalled, "She could make a line that didn't matter, suddenly mean something. It was unsettling, like watching a poem come to life." Hollywood came calling in the 1,950 seconds, and Betty answered, stepping into a machine that rewarded beauty and volume over quiet talent. She wasn't a bombshell, nor a diva. She was a character actress, and in an industry obsessed with glamour, that meant invisibility. But she didn't mind. Not yet. Betty Harford's early years were shaped by the quiet rhythm of survival. She was born at the tail end of the Roaring '20s, just as the Great Depression began to hollow out American cities. Her father worked long hours, sometimes 2 jobs, and her mother kept the household running with what little they had. In interviews decades later, Betty rarely spoke about her family. Those who knew her said she carried her past with tenderness, but also with distance, as if some memories were too fragile to touch. An old friend from the New York theater scene, the late actress Nancy Coleman, once said, "Betty had that look in her eyes, like someone who'd already lived 3 lives before she ever turned 20. She grew up fascinated by human behavior, always observing, always listening. Neighbors remembered her sitting by the window, watching people walk by, inventing stories about where they were going. It was her first form of acting, imagining the truth behind a stranger's eyes. During her teenage years, she spent hours in small playhouses, helping backstage, reading lines when an actor didn't show up. By 17, she knew she wanted to act not to be famous, but to understand people. Her first performances were on the New York stage, modest productions that paid barely enough to cover train fare. But those nights shaped her. Under the dim lights of a rented hall, she discovered something truer than applause, the joy of transformation. It was there, among the struggling artists in secondhand costumes, that she learned the paradox of performance. The more honestly you reveal yourself, the more invisible you become. And that paradox would follow her to Hollywood. When she packed her bags in the early 1,950 seconds and headed west, the city was on fire with opportunity. Television was booming, studios were expanding, and the old golden stars were fading. She arrived not as a dreamer chasing stardom, but as a craftsman looking for work. Her first casting director reportedly told her, "You have the kind of face that makes other people look interesting." It wasn't an insult, it was a prophecy. When Betty Harford arrived in Hollywood, she stepped into a world divided by illusion. The studio gates glittered, but behind them, ambition and exhaustion shared the same air. She didn't have an agent, a famous relative, or the kind of face that stopped cameras. What she did have was precision, the kind that directors rarely notice until it's too late to imagine a scene without it. Her earliest television appearances came in the mid-1950 seconds. Short stints on anthology shows like Playhouse 90, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and The Twilight Zone. It was a golden age for television, where every episode was a miniature film, rehearsed live, shot fast, and forgotten by the next week. Betty's gift was subtlety. She could play fear without trembling, guilt without tears. Producers began to recognize that when a scene wasn't working, you could hand it to her and somehow it would breathe. A young assistant from Alfred Hitchcock Presents later recalled, Betty didn't chase the camera. She waited for it to find her. And when it did, she never wasted a frame. Yet even as her work deepened, her name remained buried in the credits. Hollywood in that era adored stars who shouted, Betty spoke softly and that made her invisible. In 1965, she appeared in Inside Daisy Clover, alongside Natalie Wood and Robert Redford. A critic, Christopher Isherwood, described her performance as too big for the frame, like a soul from another, older theater. He meant it as criticism, but she took it as truth. She wasn't born for small talk or quick cuts. She came from the stage, where emotions stretched and lingered. By the late 1960 seconds, she had married and had her son, Chris. Work slowed, but she refused to quit. She took guest roles, commercial voiceovers, even background characters that lasted only seconds. Every paycheck went to raising her child. Her colleagues knew her as the one who never complained, the one who always remembered everyone's lines and made coffee for the crew. She once told a young actress on set, fame fades fast, but kindness stays on your face long after the makeup's gone. That quiet philosophy carried her through decades of being almost recognized. She built a resume thicker than most stars, but none of it came with power, and that the silent loyalty to an industry that rarely noticed her would become both her pride and her heartbreak. By the 1970 seconds, television had changed. The golden studio sheen was cracking. New, grittier dramas were taking over, and that's where fate finally gave Betty Harford her first moment of light. When The Paper Chase premiered in 1978, it wasn't just another television drama. It was a cultural reflection, a mirror held up to ambition itself, and sitting quietly at that mirror's edge was Betty Harford, as Mrs. Nottingham, the meticulous secretary who managed the storm of intellect and ego surrounding Professor Kingsfield. In a show about pressure, competition, and self-worth, Betty's presence was a small but steady heartbeat. She didn't dominate scenes, she grounded them. When students panicked, she stayed calm. When others sought approval, she offered empathy. In a world of shouting voices, hers whispered reason. John Houseman, who played Kingsfield, once said in an interview, actors like Betty Harford are the oxygen of a set. You don't notice them until they're gone, and then you realize you can't breathe without them. The Los Angeles Times later called her role a quiet revolution in character acting, a performance that gave dignity to silence. She wasn't a leading woman, but she was indispensable, a bridge between chaos and humanity. When the series ended in 1986, she was 59. Most actresses her age were being written off as past their prime, yet destiny had one last gift: Dynasty. From 1981 to 1987, she appeared as Hilda Gunnarsson, the Carrington family's loyal housekeeper. In a show bursting with excess fur, diamonds, betrayal, Hilda was the soft thread of reality. Audiences didn't talk about her, but they felt her. She represented normalcy in a world gone mad with power. Crew members said that off-screen, Betty was much like Hilda, punctual, kind, and quietly hilarious. She brought cookies to the crew, remembered birthdays, and often read poetry between takes. A sound engineer remembered her saying, "I've spent my whole life pretending to be invisible, and Hollywood paid me for it." Her son Chris years later described how proud she was of Dynasty. She knew it wasn't Shakespeare. But she also knew people at home, mothers, grandmothers saw her and felt seen themselves. In that decade, Betty finally touched a kind of fame, not flashing or loud, but warm. Fans began writing her letters addressed simply, Hilda, Carrington Mansion. She laughed about it, but she kept every one. Still, behind her calm eyes lingered a melancholy truth. The fame that had finally arrived came too late and too softly. She once joked to a friend, "I've spent 50 years waiting to be recognized, And now people think I live in a mansion in Denver. As Dynasty wrapped its final season, Betty Harford disappeared again into the quiet. No grand exit, no magazine cover, just a final line of credits fading to black. But silence, for Betty, was never the end. It was a return. When Dynasty ended in 1987, it wasn't just the close of a television era, it was the quiet fading of hundreds of supporting actors who had built that empire from the shadows. For Betty Harford, the end of Dynasty meant the end of work. The phone stopped ringing. No scripts arrived, and the city that had once buzzed with opportunity turned into a museum of broken dreams. She was 60 years old, still sharp, still capable, still willing, but in an industry obsessed with youth, she had become invisible once more. Friends from her Dynasty days tried to reach her. One of them, costume designer Nolan Miller, once told a reporter, "Betty was one of the kindest souls we had on set. She deserves so much more. But Hollywood doesn't give gold watches, it just stops calling." Her son Chris described the years that followed as a long, gentle twilight. She lived modestly in California, away from the city's glare. Occasionally she'd attend a reunion dinner or an old cast gathering, always dressed with quiet elegance. She'd smile for photos, wave, and return home before the music got too loud. But inside, the silence grew heavier. A neighbor in Sherman Oaks once said she often saw Betty sitting by her window, feeding birds and humming show tunes under her breath. She always looked content, the neighbor said. But sometimes you could tell she was remembering something, like she was waiting for the past to call her back. In truth, Betty's tragedy was not scandal or downfall. It was absence, the slow erasure of a woman who gave her life to an art that never looked back. By the early 2000s, she was almost entirely forgotten by Hollywood. No interviews, no retrospectives, no tributes. Just old reruns and fading VHS tapes where her name flashed for a second before disappearing into static. Yet those who worked with her never forgot. Director James Bridges once said, "Every time we build a story around emotion, we'd ask, can we get Betty Harford for this? She understood silence better than anyone I've ever met." When the Paper Chase cast reunited briefly in the late 2000s for an anniversary article, her absence was noted. She was living quietly, declining interviews, not out of bitterness, but because, as one old friend put it, she didn't need to be seen anymore. She had already done her part. By the time she entered her 90s, Betty had become a ghost of television's golden age, the kind people only rediscover by accident while scrolling through classic channels at midnight. But here lies the true mystery. Even after 7 decades of work, after shaping 2 of television's most beloved worlds, Betty Harford's name was barely written in the story of Hollywood history. How could someone so present become so forgotten? Perhaps that's the cruelest twist of all. She played characters who were always in the background, and in the end, life gave her the same role. As the years folded gently into the 21st century, Betty Harford became the embodiment of Hollywood's forgotten grace. While her peers chased conventions and revivals, she retreated inward, not bitterly, but peacefully, as if she had finally made peace with the silence that had always followed her. Her home in California was small, filled with books, black and white photographs, and shelves lined with scripts. Most were unmarked, dog-eared, the pages yellowed. She kept them not as trophies, but as memories, fragments of people she had once been. In 2015, when a young journalist from a small nostalgia magazine reached out for an interview, Betty politely declined, writing in her neat cursive, "I said everything I ever needed through my characters. They're still out there, saying it better than I ever could." Those close to her said she still received fan letters from women who had watched The Paper Chase in college, or families who remembered Hilda from Dynasty. She read each one, smiled, and quietly placed it in a wooden box by her bedside. Her son Chris visited often. They would spend afternoons watching old movies, the kind made before she was born. Greta Garbo, Claudette Colbert, Spencer Tracy. Chris later said, she never watched her own work. She said it was like listening to her younger self in another language. By her 90s, her health had begun to decline. Age slowed her voice, but not her spirit. A close friend recalled visiting her in late 2024. She was sitting near the window, the sun on her face. I told her she still looked ready for her close-up. She laughed that same low, warm laugh and said, "Maybe in another lifetime, darling." On the 2nd of November 2025, in a quiet California nursing home, Betty Harford passed away in her sleep. No paparazzi, no breaking news, just a brief notice in the Hollywood Reporter. Betty Harford, beloved for her work in Dynasty and The Paper Chase, has died at 98. A few days later, People magazine published a short tribute. Former castmates and fans left messages online, remembering her as Hollywood's kindest soul, the silent strength behind the camera, a woman who never needed fame to be remembered. But the truth? Most of Hollywood never even noticed. The machine had moved on. The lights that once reflected on her face were shining elsewhere now. And yet somewhere, late at night, when reruns of Dynasty flicker across old TV screens, she still exists, her voice soft but firm, her presence quiet but unshakable. It's as if she's reminding us that dignity doesn't fade, it just hums quietly in the background, waiting to be heard again. Legacies in Hollywood often belong to those who shout the loudest, the stars whose names become empires, whose scandals become currency. But Betty Harford's legacy is of a different kind. It's whispered, not shouted. It's in the pauses, the glances, the empathy between lines. She didn't just act. She reminded the world that there is beauty in restraint. Film historians now see her as part of a vanishing breed, the supporting heart of the golden age. Without women like Betty, there would be no foundation for the glimmering performances that took center stage. She was part of that invisible architecture, the backbone of television's first great dramas, when dialogue mattered more than spectacle. Critic Ann Thompson once wrote, "Betty Harford represented the women Hollywood forgot how to write, intelligent, self-contained, moral without being moralistic. She wasn't there to seduce or to rebel. She was there to hold the world together." Her characters, Mrs. Nottingham, Hilda Gunnarsson, were rarely tragic on screen, but their quiet loyalty carried tragedy beneath. They reflected the millions of real women who held lives, households, and industries together, while others took the credit. After her death in 2025, fans began revisiting The Paper Chase and Dynasty, posting clips on social media with captions like, "I never realized how powerful she was until now." A new generation discovered her not as a relic, but as a revelation, proof that subtlety can survive in an age that worships noise. Actress Jean Smart, who once shared a soundstage with her in the 1980 seconds, said during a tribute interview, "There are actors who play emotions, and there are actors who live them." Betty lived them. She made stillness look alive. In a time when celebrity often burns bright and fades fast, Betty Harford's influence now feels timeless. She embodied the working actor's truth that you don't need fame to matter. Her life stands as a reminder that greatness can exist quietly, without spotlight or scandal, and that even the smallest role can carry a world of humanity. Some say her story mirrors Hollywood itself, glittering, fragile, built on dreams that vanish the moment the lights go out. But perhaps that's where her true power lies, in being remembered by those who care to look closer. Because when the noise of fame fades, it's the gentle voices that linger. And Betty Harford's voice, soft, warm, steadfast, still lingers in the hearts of those who remember what acting once meant. When we look back at Hollywood's golden past, it's easy to remember the faces that filled the billboards. But the truth is, the heartbeat of that era belonged to the ones who stood behind them, the Betty Harfords of the world. She spent her entire life building a bridge between fame and humanity, and somehow, history forgot to cross it. That's the tragedy of Betty Harford. Not scandal, not downfall, but disappearance. She was erased not by failure, but by time's indifference. We often mistake fame for importance, yet people like Betty prove the opposite. Her characters, Hilda, Mrs. Nottingham, and the countless women she embodied, carried more emotional truth in a single glance than entire blockbusters do today. Maybe that's why her story feels heavier now. In this age of viral fame and vanishing attention, we scroll past lives like hers every day, quiet, enduring, necessary, and call them ordinary. But Betty Harford's life was anything but ordinary. It was the life of an artist who gave everything, even knowing the world might never say thank you. Hollywood often celebrates noise, the glamorous, the scandalous, the impossible. Betty represented the silence that made all of it believable. She was a mirror of a forgotten America, loyal, humble, deeply human. And perhaps that's why her passing at 98 hit deeper than anyone expected. It reminded us that there are people who build beauty not to be seen, but so others can shine. So what is the legacy of Betty Harford? It's the echo that follows after applause, the quiet proof that sincerity never ages. And maybe that's what the world needs to remember now, that sometimes the greatest performances happen in the background, In the end, Betty Harford's story is not about fame, it's about grace. A grace that doesn't fade when the lights go out. A grace that lingers in the quiet, long after the noise of applause has died. She was never the face on the poster, never the headline in the paper. Yet, she lived a life fuller than most, filled with stories, laughter, long nights of rehearsal, and an unshakable love for the craft that gave her purpose. Hollywood forgot her. But history, if it listens closely, will not. Because Betty Harford represents a vanishing truth that not all greatness needs to be seen. Some of it simply needs to exist. There's something hauntingly beautiful about the idea that somewhere, on a dusty reel in an old studio vault, her voice still lives, still speaking, still comforting, still holding together the world she once helped build. And maybe, when we watch those reruns, when we pause for a moment to look at the woman standing quietly in the corner of the frame, we'll understand that she wasn't background at all. She was the soul of the story. Time may have closed the curtain, but her presence remains like a soft echo from a golden past, reminding us that the human spirit, when carried with dignity, never truly disappears. Some stories were never meant to be known. But now, you know,